Today we're talking about the sad case of a farmer called Ray Walden who was shot by armed police in 1940 for resisting eviction from his rented farm after he'd failed to plough up as much land as the local War Agricultural Executive Committee had demanded of him. But before we do that, I thought we should briefly skirt over what all the different characters we've looked at so far on the channel were getting up to after the war broke out. David Lloyd George, the former Prime Minister, who fired the starting pistol on the class war that defines the British countryside by taxing the aristocracy. Remember him from a while ago? As he'd been the Prime Minister during the First World War, Winston Churchill asked Lloyd George to join his war cabinet as an agriculture minister, but Lloyd George refused, instead deciding to devote his time and energy to his 60-acre farm at Churt in Surrey. He grew fruit, and he had a little farm shop, just like Jeremy Clarkson. He also got his hands on a new type of machine called a gyrotiller, and he ran it through the night to rip up grassland and put it down to cereals. And he invited lots of cameras over to advertise the importance of modern methods to grow more food. I've put some videos of him talking about the Plough Up campaign in the description because I can't afford the royalties. Subscribe and that might change. Agricultural scientist George Stapledon was whizzing around the countryside supporting the Plough Up campaign and promoting grass lays, grass in rotation with other crops. His hope was that these new methods would boost agricultural productivity in the long term, and during the war he convinced the government to open lots of new research stations, a busy time for him. In 1939, Lord Lymington had spent lots of time in Berlin lecturing on his books on organic agriculture and socialising with all the top Nazis who he was very fond of. During the war his father dies, so he gets a promotion and becomes the Earl of Portsmouth, but we'll keep referring to him as Lymington for simplicity. Quick recap on him: he was an aristocrat who was so annoyed at Lloyd George's taxes on landowners that he developed his own brand of fascism, the organic movement, that intended to re-establish feudalism. He really disliked scientists because he thought aristocrats should tell people what to do, and he didn't like farmers. He wanted purebred English peasants. He had been a Conservative MP and tried to overthrow the government by hijacking the Conservative Party while it was in power to install a dictator and implement his reforms. Interesting chap. We've mostly looked at Leicestershire so far because it was the county most radically transformed by the wartime plough-up campaigns, and it's also where I'm from. In Leicestershire, the War Agricultural Executive Committee, or War-Ag, that was empowered to issue compulsory ploughing orders to farmers and evict any that were deemed uncooperative or incompetent, was staffed mostly by farmers. Here, farmers were overseen by members of their own social class, and generally it goes very smoothly. But in Hampshire, that was not the case. Lord Lymington was the vice chair of the Hampshire War-Ag under a man called Charles Churt, who he described as a landowner of ancient family and of ancient estate, living in an ancient house of national fame. Of absolute personal integrity, he typified everything that was good in the old landlord ruling class, as well as a little of its lack of imagination. In other words, all of these wartime powers over farmers and the land were given in Hampshire to aristocrats, who, as we have seen on this channel, don't like farmers very much. This distinguishes the Hampshire Committee from its Leicestershire equivalent. During and after the war, both Churt and Lymington pushed for continued landlord control. Lymington also led the Central Landowners Association from 1944, which is essentially the landlord's equivalent of the National Farmers Union, fighting the good fight for very rich people. And he joined the British People's Party during the war, which was a spin-off from the British Union of Fascists. Lymington was publicly a Nazi sympathiser, and during the war, most Nazi sympathisers were interned to keep them out of the way. But in British society, we have different rules for aristocrats, so rather than being locked up, Lymington was allowed to be on the War-Ag. In his words, "But war came, and it would be untrue in me to gloss over the fact that I did not strive very hard to stave off its onset, for I could see nothing good coming of it in a political sense. I narrowly avoided being locked up under the 18B regulation of government." So he didn't try to prevent the outbreak of war because he thought that German politics was probably preferable to that of the British. And he wrote that in his autobiography in the 1960s, A Very Strange Man. I was even reported by next-door neighbours for flashing lights to the enemy, and when the police came to investigate, I could show them that the only flashing light was 7 miles away. So he denies flashing lights to the enemy, although I'm not sure we believe him because it would be very difficult to prove that there had been no light. And he then goes on to defend it, saying that we used to be a proper country and back then you could talk to the enemy. No one could think for himself with any safety in wartime. Gone were the days of the 18th century when you could get a passport to travel across the fluctuating fronts of warring armies. A certain chivalry in wartime can sometimes obtain more enemy secrets than regimented hatred ever will. So just a quick recap there. He was in Germany giving lectures and in contact with all of the leading Nazis immediately before the war. And he doesn't try to prevent the war for political reasons. And he very probably colluded with the Nazis during wartime, which he denies but also defends. For the early days of the war, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith was the Minister for Agriculture and Sir Donald Ferguson was the Chief Secretary to the Ministry. Both of them were neighbours of ours. Almost every weekend we met and discussed agricultural policy without any inhibitions over secrecy in the shipping and supply positions. Fantastic. The committee of the Hampshire War-Ag gained a reputation for being particularly enthusiastic in exercising their powers. In 1944 they withheld animal feed rations from tenant farmers who had failed to submit their paperwork on time. And they evicted a farmer called John Crow who had previously managed the Duke of Westminster's home farm. He had taken on a tenancy at a very poor farm in the county and completely turned it round, building up a prize-winning dairy herd. Crow offered to increase milk production rather than plough up his fields and was given 3 weeks to leave. This inflexibility and apparent desire to make life difficult for farmers was in no doubt due in part to the fact the government had handed a fanatical defender of the aristocratic class interest loads of power to harass farmers in his local area. Within the War-Ag, Lymington was the vice chair of the executive committee, the chair of the National Milk Testing and Advisory Scheme, chair of the Technical Development Subcommittee, chair of the Milk and Livestock Subcommittee, on the New Forest Pastoral Development Subcommittee, and on the Rabbits and Pests Subcommittee. He was also on the Cultivations Committee, which is the big one because it issued the ploughing orders. And the Hampshire Committee behaved in line with his aristocratic tendencies. The minister had told the committees to make best use of scientific advice to increase production, and Daniel Hall, one of the most prominent agricultural scientists of the age, had recently retired from his research positions to Hampshire, where he was the acting principal of the Lord Wandsworth College. Hall had overseen the plough-up campaigns during the First World War from inside the ministry, so he was just about the most qualified person in the country to help the War-Ags, and he wrote to the Hampshire Committee offering his services. But the committee declined the offer, the real ground, it may be suspected, being that his known views on the utilisation of British land and the methods of British farming were not agreeable to the rural community of Hampshire. Fun little crossover episode for you there. Lymington hated scientists, but he particularly hated Daniel Hall because Daniel Hall was pushing for land nationalisation to increase agricultural efficiency. But that would mean the end of the landowning aristocracy that Lymington thought was essential for England's survival as a nation. Hall and his friend Orwin spend the war teaming up with medical professionals like John Boyd Orr to lobby the government to fix all the nutritional problems in the British population, before Hall dies in 1942. And that's what all of the characters were up to. We shall now introduce a new character, Rex Paterson, who is quite remarkable in this little history of agriculture in that he was actually a farmer. I tried to insert the voices of ordinary farmers into the narrative through these oral testimonies. But really, farmers are more or less invisible in the construction of their own history. We don't really have a great deal of historical agency as a group of people. The characters we talk about on this channel are politicians, aristocrats, scientists, medical doctors, or agricultural writers. But Rex Paterson is a farmer. He's an exception. Born the son of a vicar, Rex Paterson was a new entrant into the industry. He briefly went to Y College, where Daniel Hall taught, and he took up a tenancy on a farm in Kent before moving to Hampshire. In Hampshire, he tried something a little bit different and implied entrepreneurial spirit and a belief in innovation to dairy farming. At the time, it was typical for cows to be milked in the farmyard and graze in the better months of the year, walking back every day at milking time. In the winter, the cows would be kept inside, which required straw to bed them and hay to feed them. This is all very labour-intensive in the winter months, and it required buildings, which are expensive. And hay isn't as good as fresh grass. Herd sizes were often very small, only a handful of cows. But Paterson did it differently. He got a milking bale, a mobile milking parlour that you could put in the field and move around with the cows. This had lots of benefits. You didn't need to put up a building to milk the cows. The cows wouldn't need to walk between the parlour and their pasture every day, and the cows could even stay outside all year, which would reduce the need for straw and hay. You wouldn't have to bed them down, muck them out, and cart them up into the field. Paterson had a bale for about 40 to 60 cows, which was enough work for one man and a relatively large herd for the time. It was specialised and it was successful, but to grow his business, rather than getting a bigger herd, Paterson got more herds and more bales, each being overseen by one man, working relatively independently. He took on more and more land and brought more and more bales, and by the outbreak of war he was overseeing 10,000 acres and milking 4,000 cows. Paterson is a very interesting example because his business was profitable between the wars when most farms were being throttled by the agricultural depression. Believers in agricultural improvement like Daniel Hall and C.S. Orwin pointed to Paterson as proof that a 10,000 acre farm and an enterprising spirit could make British agriculture competitive on a world market even without government subsidies. Paterson also invented the buck rake, a machine used for packing grass into silage clamps. Silage was a very new method of preserving grass for use in winter, much better than hay, and only really popularised during the war as a result of the War-Ags pushing progressive methods. Bottom line, this guy was everything Lymington hated. He wasn't a purebred peasant rooted to the soil, he was a new entrant into farming. Paterson was independent, intelligent, innovative, capitalistic and successful. Naturally, Lymington harasses him. Paterson was given the highest grade by the Hampshire Committee when they surveyed his business, and he was very cooperative with their demands, but they told him he didn't have enough labour to run his business successfully, and he fell into a dispute with his landlord, Lord Lymington, over the fields that he was supposed to plough. He was told that his farms would be subject to the same controls forced upon incompetent farmers. Rex Paterson was a big deal, so this dispute was publicised in the Farmers Weekly, and an NFU report vindicated him completely and blamed the Hampshire Committee for victimisation and essentially being childish. This was an explicit conflict between big progressive farmers and aristocrats on these committees that were supposed to be promoting progressive farming. Ultimately, Paterson comes out on top, but not all farmers were big fish. Ray Walden was born in 1874 and his father died when he was young. His mother continued to manage their small rented farm at Itchenstoke while raising her children, and by 16, Ray was recorded as a farmer. And Ray stayed at the farm for the rest of his life. It was not a very big farm, about 60 acres, nestled beside a railway embankment, and he seems to have been quite a good tenant, only getting into rent arrears once after his mother's death. But he kept himself to himself. He remained a bachelor and was described as a thin-faced man who didn't shave often, wore an old hat and carried a gun, a rather fearsome old man to a child. His sister used to do his housekeeping and after his death described him as not an excitable person, to the contrary. He was very placid, sometimes when things upset him he was a little nervous. Walden had some dairy cows and presumably a little bit of ploughed land, as he had some unthreshed wheat in his yard that the committee was not happy about. We can presume that Mr. Walden either ignored or refused a ploughing order for 34 acres, which was over half the area of his farm. As an old man, perhaps without a tractor, 34 acres of ploughing was many days' work, an acre being the amount of land ploughable in a day. A compulsory ploughing order was issued on the 16th of April 1940, and on the 7th of May they contacted the landowner to see if they could find a better tenant if they got rid of Mr. Walden, and they contacted the ministry to get permission to evict him. On the 9th of July they gave him 7 days to get out, and between the 22nd and 23rd of July the siege of Borough Farm took place as armed police turned up to evict him. Walden refused to leave the house, and over the course of an 18-hour siege he hit 5 policemen with shotgun pellets, seriously injuring 1. The police initially retreated, but they came back around midnight with some tear gas canisters that were put through his windows to try and turf him out, but he refused to leave and continued to shoot at them out of the door. After a few failed attempts to enter the house, the police found him upstairs with a serious head injury, not self-inflicted, and he later died in hospital. The Daily Mail wrote, 66-year-old Raymond Walden, bachelor farmer of Owlsford, died in hospital last night after being wounded in an astonishing 18-hour one-man resistance to a siege by armed police at his farm. Tear gas bombs, rifles, shotguns, revolvers and sticks all figure in this story. In this case, the Hampshire Committee technically did everything by the book. They issued a ploughing order which was ignored, they issued an eviction order with permission from the ministry, and Ray Walden chose to have a standoff with armed police. But it does seem a little bit mean. He was an elderly man. He must have had some wheat on his farm because he had some stored, and he was ordered to plough up 55% of the entire area of his farm. And beyond the fact that that would have been very many days' work for somebody of his age, it would also have made the maintenance of his dairy herd quite tricky. So although the committee did technically do this by the book, the initial ploughing order doesn't seem very reasonable, particularly as Hampshire was well above its intended ploughing targets. Ray Walden didn't have any method of appeal against his eviction order. Committees were to contact the minister in such cases, but otherwise there were no checks on their power. Farmer and writer A.G. Street wrote Walden was fighting Nazi methods in Hampshire as stoutly as younger Britons were fighting them overseas. The real blame lies with those responsible for the administration of wartime state control of farming at that date, and principally with his farmer neighbours. To the lasting shame of British farmers in general, and Hampshire farmers in particular, history will show that not one farmer fought alongside George Raymond Walden in his hour of need. Can we blame the aristocracy for this? Maybe. It is interesting that notable examples of conflict between farmers and the War-Ag seem to happen in Hampshire, and not in Leicestershire, where the change was much more radical, but everything seems to have gone much more smoothly. And a key difference between those two places were the sorts of people that staffed the War-Ag committees. But the unnecessarily tragic case of Ray Walden shows that these ideas about the British countryside, about the aristocracy and science and the role of government, did affect people who were just trying to eke out a very simple existence on land they didn't even own. It wasn't a game. It affected people's lives and in some instances ripped them to pieces. I hope you found that interesting. There's so much stuff to talk about in the Second World War. Do subscribe. Next week I think we'll have a look at the Women's Land Army, which is very important because it gives people hope that the cultural chasm between town and country might be bridged. I'll see you then.
About 10 years ago, if you'd been in the west of England and happened to pass by Borough Farm between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, you might have noticed a small boy who didn't seem to mind at all how much smaller he was than the cows he was bringing in for milking. The little boy's name was John Hockin, and he'd never known any other life than on his father's farm.